I looked at the man standing in front of me and slowly rose from the chair, still trying to understand how he knew my name. His hand remained extended, steady and patient, as if he had already decided that this moment mattered. I took his hand politely. His grip was firm but warm, the kind of handshake that belongs to someone used to leading rooms full of people without raising his voice. Up close I could see the faint lines around his eyes, the kind formed by years of thinking rather than worry. For a moment, I searched my memory, moving through decades of faces, offices, and conference rooms that once filled my life before I chose a quieter path beside Richard. "I am sorry," I said gently, because honesty has always felt easier than pretending. "Have we met before?" The man smiled again, this time with a small hint of amusement, as if he had expected that question. "Many years ago," he said, "although you might not remember the moment the same way I do." He glanced briefly toward the ballroom behind him where the music had softened again. Through the open door, I could see several people pretending to continue their conversations while clearly watching the scene unfolding in the lounge. Richard stood among them, completely still now, his attention fixed on us. The tall man returned his gaze to me. "My name is Daniel Whitmore," he said calmly. The name moved through my memory like a key sliding into an old lock. I had heard it many times in the business world, especially in the last decade. Daniel Whitmore was not simply an executive attending the party tonight. He was the chief executive officer of the entire company Richard worked for. The recognition must have shown in my face because he nodded slightly. "Yes," he said quietly. "That Daniel Whitmore." I felt a strange mixture of surprise and curiosity. "Then I must ask again," I said. "Why were you searching for me?" For a brief moment, he did not answer. Instead, he studied my face carefully, as if confirming that time had not erased the person he remembered. Then he spoke slowly. 20 years ago, there was a strategy proposal presented to my firm during a difficult quarter. The numbers were complicated, and the board could not agree on the direction forward. One document arrived that week. It was clear, practical, and unexpectedly brilliant. I felt my breath pause slightly as the memory began returning piece by piece. He continued speaking, his voice steady. The document carried a quiet signature at the bottom. "Margaret Collins." I have been hoping to meet the person behind those ideas ever since. Behind him, the ballroom had grown almost silent now, because the people inside had realized something unusual was happening. And across the room, my husband, the man who had asked me to remain invisible tonight, was staring at the conversation that was slowly changing the entire meaning of the evening. For a moment, I did not say anything. The memory he mentioned was slowly unfolding in my mind like an old photograph being lifted from a dusty box. 20 years is a long time. Long enough for people to forget the work they once loved when life pulls them in a different direction. I looked at Daniel Whitmore carefully, trying to connect the man standing in front of me with the younger executive who had once been fighting to keep a struggling company afloat. "That proposal was part of a consulting project," I said slowly. "I was working with a small strategy group back then." The memory grew clearer as I spoke. Long nights at a wooden desk. Financial reports spread across the table. A calculator beside a cup of cold coffee. I remembered studying market projections while the city outside my apartment window slept. I had written that proposal quietly, without expecting anyone to remember my name afterward. Daniel Whitmore nodded, as if confirming every detail I had not yet spoken. "Your strategy prevented a major restructuring," he said calmly. "Most people inside the company believed the recovery happened by chance. I knew it did not." I felt a quiet warmth in my chest, the kind that comes when someone recognizes work that was never meant to be noticed. Behind him, the ballroom remained strangely quiet. The open doorway had become a frame through which several guests were watching us, pretending to sip their drinks while listening carefully. Richard stood among them, his shoulders stiff, his eyes fixed on the conversation unfolding just a few feet away from where he had asked me to remain hidden. Daniel Whitmore glanced briefly toward the ballroom and then back at me. "I spent years wondering where you went," he continued. "The consulting firm said you left shortly after that quarter ended. No forwarding contact. No new company listed under your name. You simply disappeared from the industry." I smiled faintly because the explanation was simple. "Life moved in another direction," I said. "My husband's career was just beginning then. We had responsibilities at home. It seemed easier to step away." He studied my expression for a moment, not with judgment, but with curiosity. "Easier," he repeated thoughtfully. Perhaps. But I always believed the person who wrote that proposal understood markets better than most analysts I have worked with since. The compliment settled in the quiet air of the lounge. I had not heard words like that in many years. For a long time my days had been filled with smaller responsibilities. Managing a home. Supporting Richard as his position in the company grew stronger year after year. I never regretted those choices. But hearing Daniel Whitmore speak about my old work reminded me of a part of myself that had been placed gently on a shelf and forgotten. From the ballroom came the faint sound of someone clearing their throat, followed by the soft clink of glass on a table. The entire evening seemed to be holding its breath. Daniel Whitmore folded his hands calmly and looked directly at me again. When I walked into the ballroom tonight, he said, I did not expect to find the person I had been searching for sitting quietly in the lounge. He paused slightly before adding, and I certainly did not expect to find her sitting alone. His words hung in the air, carrying a meaning that every person watching from the doorway could understand, especially the man who had asked me to remain there. I remained quiet for a moment after Daniel Whitmore spoke those last words. His tone had not been accusing, but the meaning behind it was clear enough that even the guests standing in the ballroom doorway could feel it. I followed his gaze briefly toward the room where the celebration had been happening all evening. Several people quickly looked away when they realized I had noticed them watching. Richard, however, did not move. He stood exactly where he had been before, his shoulders stiff, his expression frozen somewhere between confusion and disbelief. For the first time that evening he looked uncertain, as if the simple plan he had arranged for the night had suddenly slipped beyond his control. I turned my attention back to Daniel Whitmore and offered a small, calm smile. It was my husband's event tonight, I said gently. I assumed he had reasons for arranging the evening the way he did. The words were polite, but they carried a quiet honesty that did not need to be explained further. Daniel Whitmore nodded slowly, understanding more than I had actually said. Still, he replied thoughtfully, it surprises me when someone chooses to hide a mind like yours in a hallway. His voice was calm, but there was something firm behind it now, the tone of a man who had spent many years recognizing talent in rooms full of people trying to impress him. For a brief moment neither of us spoke. The music from the ballroom drifted through the open door again, softer now, as if the band itself sensed that the real conversation of the evening was happening outside the main room. Daniel Whitmore folded his hands loosely in front of him and studied me with the quiet curiosity of someone rediscovering an old story. May I ask you something, Margaret? He said. I nodded. Do you ever miss it? He asked. The question arrived so simply that it took me a second to answer. I knew exactly what he meant. The long nights studying reports. The challenge of solving complicated problems. The quiet satisfaction when numbers finally made sense and a strategy began to take shape. I looked down briefly at the small table beside my chair where my empty glass still rested. Sometimes, I admitted honestly. But life rarely moves in straight lines. Daniel Whitmore smiled at that, as if the answer confirmed something he had suspected. No, he agreed. It does not. He then glanced again toward the ballroom where the guests had clearly stopped pretending not to watch. A few of them had drifted closer to the doorway now, curiosity overcoming their attempts to remain polite observers. Richard stood among them, his eyes moving quickly between Daniel Whitmore and me, trying to understand how the evening had changed so suddenly. Daniel Whitmore noticed him too. For a brief moment the chief executive officer held Richard's gaze across the room. It was not an angry look. It was something far more uncomfortable than anger. It was recognition, the kind that silently asks a question without needing to speak it aloud. Then Daniel Whitmore turned back to me, his expression calm again. Margaret, he said slowly, would you mind stepping into the ballroom with me for a moment? He gestured lightly toward the open doors where the entire room seemed to be waiting. I believe there are several people here tonight who would be very interested to meet the person who once saved this company from making a very expensive mistake. I looked at the open ballroom doors for a moment after Daniel Whitmore made his request. The music inside had slowed again, and the conversations that once filled the room had faded into a strange quiet tension. Everyone was watching now, not openly at first, but carefully enough that the shift in attention could be felt in the air. I stood slowly from the chair in the lounge and smoothed the front of my navy dress with calm, steady hands. There was no reason to rush. For years I had walked into rooms filled with serious discussions and complicated decisions. I remembered how those moments felt, how silence often arrived before important conversations began. Daniel Whitmore waited patiently beside me, not pushing, simply giving me the space to choose whether to step forward. I took a quiet breath and nodded once. Then we walked toward the ballroom together. The moment we crossed the doorway, the sound of the band faded almost completely. A few musicians lowered their instruments as if they sensed that something else had taken control of the evening. Guests who had been standing in small groups slowly turned their bodies toward us. The wide ballroom that had felt lively earlier now seemed almost still, like a room paused in the middle of a story. Daniel Whitmore did not raise his voice or ask for attention. He did not need to. His presence alone had already gathered every pair of eyes in the room. He stopped a few steps inside and looked around calmly, acknowledging several executives with polite nods. Then he turned slightly toward me. I could see Richard standing only a short distance away, his face pale and uncertain. He looked as if he wanted to speak, but could not decide how. I felt no anger toward him in that moment, only a quiet understanding that sometimes people underestimate the stories standing beside them. Daniel Whitmore addressed the room, with the same steady voice he had used in the lounge. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "tonight we are celebrating the success of this company and the people who helped build it." A few polite smiles appeared among the guests, though most were still watching me with open curiosity. Daniel Whitmore continued, his tone calm but clear. "However, there is someone here tonight who played a much larger role in our history than many of you realize." I felt the attention in the room shift more strongly toward me now. Some of the senior managers leaned slightly closer to hear what he would say next. Richard remained frozen where he stood. Daniel Whitmore looked around the room once more before speaking again. "Many years ago, during one of the most uncertain quarters this company ever faced, a strategy document arrived on my desk. It changed the direction of our decisions and prevented a very costly mistake." He paused briefly, allowing the words to settle across the quiet ballroom. Then he gestured gently toward me. "The person who wrote that document is standing beside me tonight." A ripple of surprise moved through the room like a soft wave. Conversations did not start again. Instead, the silence grew deeper as people began to understand what they were hearing. Daniel Whitmore smiled faintly and added one final sentence that seemed to echo across the polished floor. "Her name is Margaret Collins." The moment Daniel Whitmore spoke my name, the silence inside the ballroom deepened in a way that felt almost physical. People who had been smiling politely a moment earlier were now looking at me with open surprise, trying to connect the quiet woman who had entered beside the chief executive officer with the story he had just shared. I could see recognition slowly forming on a few faces among the older executives, the ones who had been with the company long enough to remember the difficult quarter he had mentioned. Daniel Whitmore allowed the room a moment to absorb the information before continuing. "Some of you may remember that period," he said calmly. "Our market forecasts were pointing in the wrong direction. Several departments were preparing to approve a restructuring plan that would have cost the company millions of dollars." A few heads nodded slowly. The memory clearly had not faded for everyone. Daniel Whitmore looked at me briefly, then back toward the audience. "The strategy that corrected that mistake did not come from our boardroom," he continued. "It came from a consultant who studied the numbers carefully and proposed a different path forward." He paused again, letting his gaze move across the room. "Margaret Collins was the person who wrote that proposal." The quiet ripple of surprise returned, stronger this time. I could hear whispers beginning to form at the edges of the ballroom as people quietly repeated my name to one another. Daniel Whitmore did not seem interested in dramatic gestures. His tone remained calm, almost conversational, but the meaning of his words carried weight. "The plan she designed allowed us to avoid a costly expansion and redirect our investment toward a market that later became one of our strongest divisions," he explained. "Without that decision, the company many of you work for today might look very different." For a moment, no one spoke. Then one of the senior managers near the front of the room slowly began to clap. The sound echoed across the polished floor. A second person joined, then another, until the quiet applause spread through the ballroom in a wave of recognition. I stood there listening, feeling a strange mixture of surprise and calm. The applause was not loud or overwhelming. It was respectful, the kind given when people suddenly realize they have overlooked an important part of their own history. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Richard standing perfectly still among the guests. His expression had changed again. The uncertainty from earlier had been replaced by something quieter, something that looked almost like realization. Daniel Whitmore turned slightly toward me once the applause softened. "Margaret," he said with an easy smile. "I spent a long time wondering where the mind behind that strategy had gone." He gestured lightly around the ballroom. "Now that I have finally found you again, I have to ask an important question." The room grew quiet once more as everyone waited to hear what he would say next. Daniel Whitmore met my eyes directly before speaking. "Have you ever considered returning to the world you once understood so well?"